to start with a reading, but it's going to be really, really short. I'm just going to read the beginning of the first essay in the book, which is called Toward a Theory of a Dead Girl Show. Twin Peaks, David Lynch's early 90s noir fantasy about small-town Washington, provides 30 of the oddest and most influential hours in the history of television. I watched them all in my little apartment in Missoula, Montana with stolen internet 20 years too late. I was prepared for it to be a relentlessly quirky murder mystery with its sweet and idiosyncratic hero, FBI agent Dale Cooper, the bizarre Twin Peaks townies like the woman who carries around a psychically gifted log, the story's flirtation with the supernatural, including visions, demons, and aliens, and the town's supremely seductive teenage girls whose saddle shoes and sweater sets say, "Welcome to Twin Peaks. Please set your clocks back 40 years." I wasn't prepared for how, in its stubborn weirdness, it tells a story at least as old as America. As Grail Marcus outlines in his essay, Picturing America, Twin Peaks is manifest from the film noir tradition, a genre that is obsessed with setting. The mid-century detective stories of Raymond Chandler and Ross MacDonald are less about the criminal mind than systemic corruption. Cities that are growing too fast, both booming from the war and reeling from its losses. It was the pretentious provincial city, Marcus says of the film noir city, where the most respectable citizen is always the most criminal. A town big enough to get murders written up as suicides, and small enough that no one outside the place cares what happens there. Lynch's innovation to the form was to add something more psychologically elemental. Twin Peaks' plot is sparked by the murdered body of 17-year-old Laura Palmer washed up on the banks of a river. Palmer's corpse is Twin Peaks' truly memorable image. River wet hair slicked around her perfect porcelain face, blue with death but still tranquil, lovely. One question, who killed Laura Palmer, spawned a genre. Veronica Mars, The Killing, Pretty Little Liars, Top of the Lake, True Detective, How to Get Away with Murder, and The Night Of are all notable descendants of Twin Peaks. All Dead Girl shows begin with the discovery of the murdered body of a young woman. The lead characters of this series are attempting to solve the often impossibly complicated mystery of who killed her. As such, the dead girl is not a character in the show, but rather the memory of her is. Thank you. I'm going to sit down.
So thank you all so much for coming, and let me make sure that this mic is on. So listening to this and obviously having read Dead Girls and just feeling like this is such a wholly necessary and important collection, but I wondered, like, what was your first experience of the Dead Girl trope, and when did you realize that it was a trope as opposed to just, you know, some plot device or and the like? And I'll start with Alice, but I want to hear sort of your first experience of the trope.
Well, Veronica Mars is definitely my favorite Dead Girl show, and it probably was the first one that I ever watched. I mean, yeah. Like, and I remember I saw it like on MTV, it was being replayed because I watched MTV like 24/7. And I was like, what is this show? I watched it from the very first episode. But I don't think at that point that I realized that it was one in a long line of these shows. I'd never seen Twin Peaks. I didn't know anything about it. And so I feel like then I watched Pretty Little Liars, and then I was like, oh, this is like a Dead Girl show. Like that is totally what it's playing with, especially because it's Dead Girl like won't stay dead. She keeps coming back to life and sort of popping up here and there, and she has this very odd and sinister power over the living girls in the show. I think that's when I started making jokes about Dead Girl shows on Twitter. Just, you know, for likes or faves as they were at that time. But that, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like you start out joking about something on Twitter and then now you're the dead girl forever, so.
Well, I do remember when Twin Peaks first aired, and I was probably, what year was it? I don't know. I was probably like 90? 10 or 11. Yeah, I was 10. So I was, and also I was like, I was allowed to watch whatever I wanted. So I watched it and it scared me. I'll go back a little. My dad had told me to watch Blue Velvet once by myself. And we had like a rec room in our basement, and I watched it in the rec room and fell asleep while it was on, and then it got dark when I woke up, and I woke up to just the end, to him with like the oxygen mask. Anyway, so it disturbed me profoundly, but I actually found the Laura Palmer image very, like I loved it, and I was really, that was what I liked about the show, and I was attracted to that, and I could sort of never figure out why. And then I realized when I was watching Veronica Mars, which I love and got me through like an incredibly difficult time, that the thing about the dead girl not being really dead, but sort of in this liminal space where she like drifts through is always, I guess I never realized before how much that happens and how much I kind of like it when it happens, honestly.
Yeah.
I feel boring because mine are somewhat similar, but I also didn't allow myself to watch scary things when I was little because I was an anxious child. But I would read novels. So my dead girls always came in the form of R.L. Stein's Fear Street.
Oh yeah.
But then that prepared me to encounter them. I mean, I think for me, starting to watch a lot of Law and Order when I was in college, and then became really addicted to it. I became addicted to the episodes where someone goes missing. And it's all about trying to find this woman who's been brutalized somewhere in New York City. And that's where I learned, all these episodes are very formulaic, and the dead girl's usually at the center of one of them.
And to sort of like unpack some what you were saying about the dead girl not staying dead, or the dead girl being victim, but also being maybe aggressor or sometimes seductress, or just traveling that space between, are we supposed to feel bad for her? Are we supposed to feel that she's bad? And what is that in between space for you?
Right. I think it is kind of a classic ghost story in some ways. Like, I mean, I was actually just thinking about Wuthering Heights as you guys were talking about Kathy, who's like one of the most demonic and bizarre characters of all time. And she comes back, Heathcliff, she's actually she seems sort of like an original dead girl in some ways, except she has a bit more agency as a ghost. Probably maybe because she was written by a very weird woman, but
a whole litany of weird
right.
sisters in that
right.
environment.
So
too.
it's kind of like that she gives her ghost a little bit more power than, and that's the thing. It kind of feels like the dead girl is sort of this like neutered ghost. She's like a ghostly presence, but she doesn't really have the power to do anything. She's just a cipher.
I guess I also think of it in terms of Laura Lippman has this common comment about crime fiction, which is that so much of it is a beautiful woman dies and a man feels bad about it. And I just wondered, I just kind of want to hear what everybody has to say about that line and just what we keep running up against in terms of crime narratives, be it film, TV, fiction, and the like, and why we sort of keep going back to it over and over instead of trying to reinvent it. Can we make something new out of it? And I'll just start with you guys because you're closest.
Well, I think one of the narratives that to pull from fiction that I learned this trope from was Jeff Eugenides' The Virgin Suicides, which is really 5 girls die and the boys feel bad about it. And I think for me, my opinion of that book has changed a lot as I've gotten older. When I first read it, I thought it was like the most romantic book I'd ever read. I was like, they all kill themselves in this like beautiful Sofia Coppola haze, and like it's the 70s and everyone's sad. And as I get older, I'm like, wow, this is just a story where these women who were dealing with deep depression and trauma and abuse were they were the device by which these men discovered themselves and grew up. Yeah. And that's what they were there for. And I know that there's sort of a meta commentary on that in the book, but I also think in a lot of ways it romanticized that idea for me, that you could be your death could be some boy's lesson. And that's what you could hope for if you came to an untimely end.
And I also wonder too, just Eugenides wrote the novel, but Sofia Coppola then made the film, and was her interpretation thus subverting all this stuff that was sort of lurking underneath and making it more feminist or more moving it away from the trope. So I don't know, is that something that any of you sort of thought about, or?
I will say
these are the things that come off the top of my head.
I know they are. I think it's a little bit different. It's a little bit of a different answer to your question, and not nearly as intellectual, but I will say that there is something about being a teenage girl and reading these books and then going back as an adult and reading them, because I had a similar experience where I found The Virgin Suicides on a shelf when I was 16 and I read it. And first of all, I thought the device of using we as a narrator was the most inspired, amazing thing ever, which I actually, it still stands up, but I was like, this is, but I also really liked the film when it came out, and I actually have not revisited the film because I really want to keep liking Sofia Coppola a lot. She's making a film with an author, Alicia Abbott, who is a really amazing author who wrote, what's the name of her book?
Oh, I'm blanking, but I know.
She wrote Alicia Abbott, you should look her up. She wrote a great book. That was an incomplete answer. I apologize to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that many thoughts about The Virgin Suicides. I mean, I think it is a very good example of this odd way that I think that all teenagers kind of have this like die young, leave a beautiful corpse, maybe not all, hopefully not all, but every single one. But I think that's very common, for like, that really appeals to like the melodrama of adolescence.
Or like the murdered girl, what would your description be?
Right, like the idea of wanting to, because I think that it appeals to this feeling of like life is too hard, I don't want to mature, fear of becoming a boring adult. Maybe that is why we like why teenage girls see Laura Palmer and think like maybe that's a way for me, because there is this kind of fear of growing up, especially growing up as a woman. It's incredibly fraught and difficult, FYI. So, and rife with contradictions, and so maybe that dead girl kind of path, especially for white women, feels sort of like a way to be successful in some way or to be adored without really having to, go through. Well, it's done to you. You don't have to do it.
I was also thinking of the dead girl trope, not just in terms of fictional characters, but in terms of, how it actually happens in real life, but is then sort of transmuted into this sort of hyper-real sense through reality TV, Dateline, 2020, other, now podcasts and documentaries. And so one of the discussions that we sort of had online leading up to this panel was this idea of true crime as camp. So I wanted to start with you, Alice, because you brought it up, but I think all of us have something to offer on that particular subject.
Yeah, I mean, I used to always tweet about Dateline when I would watch. It's like the most fun thing to live tweet. Eventually, I had to block the actual Dateline account because they kept replying to me. But and I think it's because it is very funny and melodramatic. It's got this clunky voiceover, and it always is trying to sort of wrestle the truth, which is often very contested and confusing and upsetting about, a domestic violence murder or some strange, mysterious murder that has never been solved, into these narrative tropes that we already understand, where it's always like, they were the perfect couple. That's always the beginning of every Dateline. Or like Nashville, Tennessee, home to a thriving medical community. Two members of that medical community were, it's always trying to sort of like write the story that they would have written if it wasn't about real life. And I think that's part of where the humor comes in. That's part of where the melodrama is this dissonance between the utter, unsatisfactoriness of the true story and the amount of melodrama they're trying to wring from it. And I feel like that's part of why it's campy and why it is funny.
And there's something too where when they're describing a female victim, they never want to say that she did anything bad. So it's always like, she dabbled in drugs, but she was trying to get better. There's never sort of like that story of them being flawed in any way is totally uninteresting.
Because how can you be flawed in a half-hour episode or even an hour?
Yeah, you can't, because they need you to they do that thing where before every commercial break, they're like, but wait, was there something else? And
Right.
like you can't do that.
Yeah, I remember one episode of Dateline that I watched where the victim's dad said, like, she was an okay mother. And I was like, I've never heard that one before. Usually they're gonna say you were the perfect mother.
Well, I know you wrote about the staircase when
Oh,
the
the
three most
staircase.
recent episodes came out.
Oh, Lescalier.
And I feel like it's not just about true crime.
L'escalier. That is what it is in French.
I know.
And so it's not just about true crime as camp, but also what gets put in these documentaries and how we represent victim and perpetrator, but also obviously what gets left out.
Well, yeah, I'm about to drop a bombshell on you all and at the end of the staircase thing. But like, I think the staircase is really, I mean, I started watching that when it first came out in the early 2000s, and that case was ongoing. Have you guys all seen the Netflix show now?
You've
Know
all
about the
seen it?
staircase?
Good.
Okay, well, the short story, the short version is that in the early 2000s in Durham, North Carolina, a woman ends up dead at the bottom of the stairs in her mansion. Her very rich husband is the one that calls 911, but he's immediately suspected of doing the murder because there's just more blood than you would ever think would end up on the bottom of a staircase. Just up the walls, it's all over, and looks basically like impossible for her to have fallen down the stairs and died this way. So this French filmmaker, Jean-Javier Lestrade, decided that he would come and film Michael Peterson, who is the accused husband in this case, throughout the entire trial. He has a very slick lawyer named David Rudolph. Long story short, it's one of the most biased and crazy documentaries I've ever seen in my life. It is truly on the side of the defense in a way that is masked and also totally obvious for the entire time. And yet there are still things that are left out. And when I was writing about it, I found out that the editor of the series, who is this French woman named Sophie, was sleeping with Michael Peterson at one point. Not put in the series.
7 years.
For 7 years. Not put in the show. And then later she gave an interview in 2015 that was like, that did not affect at all my editing. And I think when I found that out, I was like, wow, true crime is not exactly true. And there are a lot of ways in which we are manipulated through our love of our sort of like greed for these stories. Like we just want to know. I want to know how someone died so intensely. And I don't understand what that's about. But like when I was watching The Staircase as a younger person, I think I first encountered it in college, I couldn't get enough of it because and at the same time, I still know nothing about Kathleen Peterson. The show tells me nothing about the victim. I don't have any emotional investment in her life. So I think it's a failure.
That's a huge problem
Yeah.
of the show. It's like this gaping black hole of
It's like cereal.
we don't get to empathize or even understand
And
what
all
she's
those
about.
guys did it. Adnan did it. Michael Peterson did it.
Did
Stephen
it.
Avery.
Did it.
Dropping some truth bombs here tonight.
Fully did it.
Adnan did it. That's allegedly. So I guess, he was convicted, but
But it was overturned.
yeah. Okay. So I think that I write a little bit about the bling ring in the book, and I feel like that's where I started to really like get in my head about true crime isn't true, or about the ways that we kind of consume those narratives of crime narratives, because that is an example where there's the reality show, there's the very famous Nancy Sales, piece in Vanity Fair, and then there's also the movie, and all of those, even though they're telling the same story and they have the same characters, you would not necessarily come to the same conclusion about those characters from consuming any of those things. And also that people are still telling very conflicting accounts of what happened, when the bling ring, these Hollywood teenagers who stole a bunch of shit from celebrities, sorry for swearing, so when they, what they talk about it now. So the accounts, people have such high stakes in these true crime stories. People have such an investment in their account of it that of course suffuses the narratives of them.
That kind of I want to get back to, the more general thing of why especially women love true crime. But since you brought up the bling ring, I was thinking about some of the interviews that you've given where people keep wanting to ask you about scammers.
Yeah.
And, there's Anna Delvey and there's the hipster grifter. But I feel one thing I was thinking about scammers and grifters are in relation to this other thing that you've talked about too, which is instead of the dead girl, that you're more interested in survivors.
Yeah.
So if scammers are survivors, are scammers also the final girls?
Well, scammers are anti-heroes, right? I mean, like, we love them for what they get away with. And we identify with them like, oh, that could be me if I had thought of that, or if I had that much gumption, like I could be Anna Delvey. Apparently you can trick a bank into giving you $1 zillion just by being like, please give me the money. It kind of reveals the rules of the world to be fake, Like we all were abiding by those rules that actually apparently you don't have to abide by. That's the lesson of the Trump administration too. So I think, so I don't think that they're necessarily final girls, but I do think that those survivor stories that I'm interested in, often those survivors have survived through means that we might not approve of, or who are not necessarily angels, so to speak. They're people who have been crafty or scrappy or have gone through some shit and come out the other side. So I think that is the connection with all the grifters.
Yeah, there is an old word from the 1930s that I think we should start using again, which limbs this area between grifter and survivor, and it was called adventuress.
Yes.
And it was a word that was applied to women who had literally been around the horn on an adventure, hopping from man to man or scam to scam to try to make their way through the world. But it was also somewhat of a, coveted position because it meant you were free. Yeah. And it meant you could move. And I think there's this weird area between grifters, scammers, and survivors, which is getting loose of something that was holding you down. So it's hard because I kind of admire someone like Anna Delvey who just decided she was going to move through the world, right? But then ends up in Rikers, so she's not very free right now.
I do think there is something with Anna Delvey, though, where it does speak a lot about white privilege, where it's sort of like if you're a white woman, you can go into a bank and be like, I need a credit line, and that can happen, and nobody will sort of doubt you. And that's not, it's something that people have talked about, but.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that white women can go anywhere. That kind of freedom of movement is one of the things that, it's one of the kind of chief privileges of white womanhood, that you can be anywhere and not be a threat or not be suspected or, not be picked out immediately. There's something non-threatening about white womanhood. But Anna, it's the thing too, where Janet Malcolm is the one who says that con artists, it's not correct when people say, oh, if he had just been in business, he would have been a billionaire, but instead he decided to be a con artist. And she's like, no, con artists have nothing in common with legitimate business people. They are artists. They love freedom.
It's right there in the phrase.
Right.
Why do we keep forgetting this? Right.
They love freedom and they hate authority and they love to daydream and they're imaginative. So it's these interesting I think that's part of why us as writers, are drawn to these stories of grifters, because there's something so creative about it, so imaginative about it.
In my own case, I keep reading grifter stories because to me they feel like the inevitable embodiment of why anybody comes to America or seeks the dream, and it's about perverting it, subverting it, and the like. But I also kind of wanted to unpack a little bit about white women privilege, because I think that's especially prevalent in the true crime genre. I was thinking about My Favorite Murder, and its primary audience is white women. Stay sexy, don't get murdered, all that. But I guess what room is there to kind of expand true crime as a genre outside of white women?
You mean as an audience or as a subject?
Both, but maybe that's a super
maybe
big
that's
question.
The problem. Yeah. Maybe if all if we are still only trying to appeal to white women with our stories, then you know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll rephrase it, which is what kind of true crime stories would all of you like to see that you're not seeing?
Well, when I did this to you yesterday too. In my book, my mother is an imperfect victim. She's a drug addict and she's a sex worker, and I sort of chose to tell her story rather. I do go into detail about how she was murdered, but it was that I get people who email me and say, "I loved your book. Can your next book just be about Rhode Island crime?" Like, I wasn't really interested in the other stuff.
Oh my God.
And they're earnest about that. They're not jerks. But I think it goes along with the idea that Dateline is so formulaic. I literally fall asleep to Investigation Discovery. We have cable so that I can watch Investigation Discovery, put on like Moms Who Murder, and fall asleep because it's so rhythmic. And that, I think, it becomes very lazy, and you're not actually investigating anything. It's sort of true crime. As like the most formulaic, kind of super cheap because the people are doing it for free. All the reenactments are done in Canada. So it can be very lazy, and you can put it out there and people can rely on the idea that it's true crime and get people to cover it.
I mean, it's really hard to say I would love to see more diversity in true crime, but that's like me saying I'd love to see so many more people get murdered.
Right.
I mean, that is unfortunately the natural extension of this argument, yeah.
But I would like to see crime and justice and investigation being done in the kind of communities that aren't often covered on television, especially in these big Netflix specials, especially, I think that one of the reasons that people love a lot of these the new splashy ones that have come up is that they involve this intersection of money and folly and death and escapism. But I also think they're made for entertainment, and I would love to see a lot more that involve thinking about, the political ramifications of these killings.
Yeah, there's a level where I think there's one reason, well, it all goes back to place for me when it comes to crime stories, because I think actually one reason that true crime is so popular is because it's one of the few venues where we see our communities depicted. Like, there have been, it's like I'll see places I've lived where it's like, oh, Moscow, Idaho, Sleepyburg, or Missoula, Montana, or Memphis, Tennessee. And they're not depicted in the ways that they typically are. Where like there's this Dateline about like a woman who like did Zumba in Memphis, and that was like what they talked about. Yeah. Yeah. And then the Zumba teacher solves the murder. Okay. I'm sorry. But like, speaking of campy, so I feel like that's one thing I like about it. I mean, I think that the fact that, even like when I met a guy who was from Boone, North Carolina, or he had gone to college there, and I was like, oh my God, I saw an episode of like some murder show that was set there, and it looked like the most beautiful place. And he was like, but it really did. I was sort of like, wow, this place looks gorgeous. Like they had depicted it in a very flattering light. So I feel like I like that about it, and I wish that we could have more diversity in storytelling and in the narratives that we see, and things that are not depicting all the same kind of victim or all the same kind of perpetrator. And I think stories that are, if stories are complex, I think they should be portrayed in a complex way, in a way that leaves open the possibility of nuance. Anyway.
What you brought up about place is also so key to what makes crime fiction work. And you have an essay, it's one of my favorites, and I think it might be all of our favorite, which is about the Scandinavian crime fiction and your dad.
Yes.
So what is it about Scandi crime, which is a phrase I don't really like, but there it is.
The Nordic noir.
The Nordic noir. Why did you pick that particular subgenre to really unpack and get into.
Well, when I first published my Dead Girl Show essay, somebody tweeted, "This should have more about the Nordic noir in it." I was like, I only have 2,000 words. But but then I kind of took, I was like, yeah, you're right. Like, I took that as like a challenge kind of. And it was, it was just dovetailed perfectly with my, the stuff I'd been thinking about when it comes to my dad, who has, read crime fiction and like exclusively crime fiction, especially international crime fiction for my whole life. And it kind of was that thing where you realize like, oh, maybe that's part of why I'm writing my book. Maybe that is part of the origin of my interest in these things, is his interest in them. And yes, his, psychotic obsession. I see him back there with, he's here, with especially the girl with the dragon tattoo.
Which I feel like we need to talk about more as promulgating. It thinks that it's subverting the dead girl trope and all of the things that we've been talking about, and yet it's so of its place. And I'm just going to start with Leah and Rachel in terms of what you guys thought of Stieg Larsson and all of the things that he thought he was doing but really wasn't.
Well, like what, Lisbeth as a character?
Yeah, as a cartoon or...
Yeah, I mean, she's like what a guy who's never met a cool girl before, but thinks that's the coolest girl in the world. Right?
Yeah,
like she's
absolutely.
a computer programmer and she's got short bangs.
It's like manic pixie computer programmer.
Right, like big piercings.
Superhero chick, yeah.
But she also, she's described as like being so skinny that she barely has breasts, and she's very much sort of infantilized. Like she doesn't have long hair. She's kind of this sprite that
that
exists
people
between
think
things.
that she's a 12-year-old and stuff like that.
That's all the time. They talk about how young she looks.
And that she looks anorexic.
Yeah.
I mean, but I do think, I definitely make fun of the books, and they're not my favorites, but I definitely I think she is absolutely the redeeming point in them, though. Like, I think that she, in the end, is a really interesting and, sympathetic character who has a lot of complexity to her. She doesn't always behave in the way you think she's going to behave. She's surprising and very charming. So,
especially when she's getting revenge.
Right.
Right, it's her kind of amorality is really what's fascinating about her, rather than this morality that they try to kind of place on her in the narrative. Her sort of being like, oh, I hate that guy, I'm going to steal all his money and murder him. Because she's not bound by the same rules as we are, I guess.
She's
Speaking
a
of,
scammer.
yeah, she is a scammer, like Joanne the scammer.
I feel like we could keep talking about true crime for hours and hours and hours, but I feel like it's incumbent upon me to bring up another strand of your essay collection, which is all about Los Angeles. Because I feel like you were trying to write about LA in a way that either hasn't been depicted, it's not just wholly personal to you, but also trying to unpack an experience that lots of other people may have that isn't part of, again, the LA narrative trope. So why don't you just talk about what LA meant and still means to you, and then we'll open it up, because I feel like both of you also have a very specific and personal relationship with Los Angeles also.
Yeah, I had never been to California before I decided to move there when I was 25. I was living mostly in the Mountain West for my whole life. And so there is a whole cliche in Idaho that people move there from California. And if you have California plates, people will spit on your car and stuff, because people hate interlopers from California who come and ski or whatever. So my idea of California was just oh, that's where people move here from. That's a place that's very fancy with lots of stores, unlike here. Everyone drives on the interstate there, as they call it, the freeway. So when I moved there, it was I had nothing to picture. I had nothing in my mind. All I could think of were, reality TV shows that I had seen, or red carpets. I had no coherent picture of what the city of LA was like. And so when I finally saw it, I was like, wait a second. And it took me a very long time to really learn the city or learn about it, because I was kind of coming up against all these assumptions that I had, where in reality, I mean, I love Los Angeles and I loved living there, but it is, it's a city that's extraordinarily diverse. It is, what they call a majority minority city. I have some issues with that term, but very diverse, tons of ethnic enclaves, amazing food, and it's a very unpretentious place. It's just like strip mall heaven. And it kind of took me a long time to figure out, like, well, it's really not that much more than that. Like, it's just a place like everywhere else.
Do you agree? How do you sort of take on that?
I agree. I mean, I think the thing that shocked me about LA, finally going there after a long time, that was like the moon juice lady. Like that's in a
Amanda Chantal Bacon.
that's in a strip mall. Like everything is.
Absolutely.
It is a city that sort of defies your expectations in that way.
LA. I really always want to move there. I flirt with it constantly, but instead I just decided to write a book about it from New York, which is basically the most cowardly thing you can do, because you're basically still working with the dream version of LA. Fortunately, I'm writing LA history, so a lot of it was written through, but I think no matter when you're writing about LA, it's a secret city in a way that New York is not. Mm-hmm. By which I mean, New York reveals itself to you right away. The first day I moved here, I felt like a New Yorker, and I think a lot of people that connect with it do. LA, everyone tells me it takes you at least a year to understand even sort of the fabric of the place, the very most essential, the basest part of the place, let alone the nuance. And I think that is, I've lived in LA, but I think it's that kind of sense of having to, it feels like a dream place, like everyone there is a transient. And at the same time, there are people that are really deeply rooted there, but they're not that open about it. So it's a constant moving through it, meeting one person who helps you meet another person, whereas in New York, it's much more transparent.
Yeah, it's a difficult place to visit, I think, is part of why a lot of people hate it. I mean, you aren't going to go there and immediately see the cool place to go, or immediately have any sense of what is, a good restaurant versus a bad one. Everything kind of is in a strip mall, I mean, and it's about knowing locals who can tell you where to go.
I mean, you had so many good descriptions of getting lost on freeways, or just, trying to figure out how to get one place and then ending up miles and miles from where you wanted to be. And I guess it's just solitude in LA and loneliness in LA is such a specific thing.
Well, yeah, California depression is a different.
Yeah, I
it's
call
a
it
mood.
Los Angelonely, for sure.
Or Lana Del Rey-ness.
Yeah.
But I think it's I'm from the West. I'm from New Mexico, which has a very different vibe altogether. But in general, the idea of being sad under the sun is a whole. There's, it's a canon of literature just devoted to that idea. But I think people that, it's navigating that sense of everything is always beautiful here all the time, beautiful and empty.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like that malaise, essentially, is the word for it.
I also have to tell you that somebody I know who loved your book and read it said that your essays about LA, more than the exploring dead women and these tropes, were the most harrowing essays for her to read, because she just kept thinking, I hope she gets a good apartment. She was very concerned for you.
I mean,
should we spoil it?
It was cheap, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wrote, there's a little essay in here all about the crazy roommates that I had in LA, but yeah, I ended up in an apartment in Koreatown that was $550 a month because we were scamming the landlord, so I'm a scammer. I mean, I guess I'm coming out as a scammer.
So before I open it up for questions, the one last sort of topic I wanted to touch on is something that I know you said in an interview, of the idea of how can I use the personal essay instead of letting it use me. And we've all written personal essays. I think we all will continue to write personal essays, but it feels like this is the central question, isn't it? Especially of women writing, in terms of essays being seen as some, quote, cheaper labor, even though I know for me it's the damned hardest thing I've ever written, and it always will be. So I just want to hear more about why you say that and what you think about that, and then.
Yeah, I actually would love to hear what you ladies think about it. Because yeah, that is sort of one of the central questions of the book, is how to navigate a genre that's become so feminized and that is especially so associated with many very famous white women like Joan Didion or Susan Sontag, and how to tell the narrative of my life in a way that is ethical and that brings to light some of the privilege and complicity that I have been, guilty of. The ways that I was the author of my own story, as much as I want to feel like the story is about, things happening to me. So that's all very vague, but I don't know, thinking about the kind of guilt that I share in a lot of sort of the things that I have experienced was a big part of sort of really finishing the book.
So I was writing a memoir for so many years. I was writing a memoir for 12 years. And people would ask what I was writing, and I would say a memoir, and they would say, what do you have to write a memoir about? I literally cannot tell you how many people said that to me because I was young looking, because I was a young woman. And then inevitably I would have to say, well, my mom was murdered when I was 4, and then my dad died when I was 18, and then they're falling all over themselves apologizing, and it's embarrassing for everybody, which is why you should never say that to anybody. And I think people said that to me because I was a young woman. I mean, somebody said that to me at McDowell. So it wasn't just like, it was, that's the idea that a young woman can have nothing to write about is common everywhere.
And it's so devaluing.
It's so devaluing. And then once they found out that I was writing this sort of tragic thing, then it suddenly gave it value. And I think for that reason, I resisted the idea that it was a memoir for a long time. And I would say, well, it's not really a memoir. It's a sociological, it studies New England and Rhode Island and the loss of industry. And then when I finally wrote the thing, I was like, oh no, this thing is a memoir. Like this is the story of my parents through me. I am the through line of all of this. And like, that's okay. And so I'm always kind of encouraging people, especially young women, to try it, and maybe it doesn't work, and maybe it is solipsistic, and but so what?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the personal essay has been demonized because there are two sides to it. I think there are people who ask you to spill your worst story of trauma for $50 online, and then don't compensate you, and then it goes viral and nothing ever comes of it, and you've given away the goods. And then there's some of the most beautiful and profound and nuanced writing of all time that just so happens to be memoir and personal essay. And by the way, you all should read Leah's memoir. It is beautiful.
It's incredible.
And one of the most, just sense of place in that book also is just so wonderful. But I think, my sense of personal essay, people, I write too, but I think people always say, well, what's the key? And I'm like, well, the key is that any genre can be good or bad and full of historical research, sense of place, reporting, and very serious writing and language. And that can apply when you're the subject or when someone else is. I think it's like, I don't think it's a prerequisite for it to be solipsistic or inward looking or shallow. I think it's just whatever you're reporting on, and sometimes you're the self.
Can I ask you a question? So when you did your piece on selfies,
yeah,
can you talk about that?
This would come up.
I just want to
selfies?
ask you about that. Yeah, I'm just curious.
Because now it's been a few years, and so how do you look back on that?
I think I still stand by it. I wrote this big, long, 7-chapter piece, short book about selfies and whether or not they should be demonized. And this was during the time. I know this is going to feel like ancient history because the world is on fire, but there was a time during the Obama administration when like the biggest thing was that people were taking selfies, and everyone was mad about it. It was like, oh God, someone brought a selfie stick into a museum. It feels 1,000 years old. Like I had to be like justice for the girls at the baseball game who were taking selfies when all these men. Do you guys remember that viral video? But it really was a problem for a while. Everyone was like, are the millennials just the new narcissi and all this? And I had to go look into it. And my takeaway was that, I looked at all these historical precedent of women who tried to take their own picture dating back to the beginning of cameras and try to figure out, the language of talking about the self, and also sort of the denaturing, like the clipping yourself off, sending it off into the world to have adventures that you'll never have, the interaction of your selfie with other people, and sort of like the whole sort of literature of like what it means when you send yourself out into the world. And I think that's very personal essay. I mean, in a lot of ways, like a selfie, which is a little tiny, it's a photo shoot directed by yourself, basically. And you have you're aesthetically controlling everything, and then you send it out. That's the same thing as writing a personal essay in a lot of ways, in so much as like, I think both things are looked at as staring inward, when a lot of it is about control and also exploration.
Well, yeah, the thing of like calling something navel gazing, I think it's just the worst critique. It's kind of like, okay, yeah, like this is about herself. Like, what else do you have to say about it? But I feel like I learned to write personal essays. I feel like from the beginning as a nonfiction writer, because I was a poet to begin with. Well, and before that I was something else, but that I felt like I was a critic. Like, I felt like what I had to say was about art and movies. Like, I had opinions. And I learned to put myself in it through editors being like, this needs a hook. This needs something to connect with a reader. This is not, interesting. So I learned to sort of filter my subjects through myself. And I learned that a lot of the time when I was being a critic, what I was really doing was sort of probing the role of art within my own life, and sort of the parallel narratives that existed when you're kind of like when you're binge watching a show and also like having a breakup. Those are like two kind of narratives that are happening at the same time, or something scoring. It's like the score to your life. But at the same time, if you're filtering things through yourself, you're also filtering them through ideas about white femininity, or I am, that I have to be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only way I'll close it before opening it up is that for many years I resisted writing personal essays. I thought I was bad at it. I thought that I had nothing to say. And then life happened, and all of a sudden I had things to talk to discuss. And I feel like the best personal essays, you get a sense that people should respond to the pieces, not to the person. So does that make sense as a concept?
Yeah. Well, and like ones that I've read by you, I mean, I feel like it's always about wrestling with a question in nonfiction, and that's usually your through line or your plot. That's what Mary Carr says in The Art of Memoir, that our plots in nonfiction are about having these warring selves, or having these kind of, having these questions that we want answered. And I think whether that question is about, Vladimir Nabokov, or whether it's about, your experience of, becoming a mom, that doesn't apply to any of us, that is the same thing. It's the same mechanism. It's the same engine that's driving the piece.
Well, and I think that like one of the reasons that personal writing has become more associated, I think women do it a lot and do it really well, because this idea that where you meet the material can be completely neutral, I think is this idea that's been conferred on. It's like a patriarchal idea, right? It's like, I'm writing a biography of someone and I'm a man and I know them and I can tell you exactly what happened on this day, and that's what happened. Whereas I'm much more interested in writing that's like, this is where I meet the material. This is my anxiety about it. This is like what I think, where my doubts are. Mm-hmm. And I think because women for a long time have not been given the encouragement or permission to speak with that sort of omniscient, all-knowing voice, the personal slips in. And I think that's actually what I like to read. It shows me there's a human on the page, and it shows me where somebody is, where their mind's working. That's what I love about your book so much. I can just watch your mind at work. It's like, great.
Yes, I had a discussion with this where we were just like, your mind goes so fast and in so many places.
It's true.
We
can be a problem.
All hail Alice's brain. And on
no.
We have time for a couple of questions. And excellent.
Tara. Hey. Thanks, that was great. It was really very interesting. My question for you guys actually has to do with how you feel about the ethics of crime as entertainment. And this is something that, I think of, I think about a lot. I come from, I was a crime reporter, before my current career. And so when I think about things like My Favorite Murder and stuff like that, and people talking about crime and true crime, and this, I'm struggling with this myself. Like, how does this actually work? I would love to hear you guys talk about what that all means when you're like, oh, I love this. This is campy, or this is funny, or, I also am addicted to watching Law and Order, right? I mean, it's Olivia Benson. Who does not want to marry Olivia Benson, right? She's like that woman. So please, could you elucidate a little bit about that?
Can we talk about the elephant in the room of
What?
So My Favorite Murder is so
Oh, My
bad.
Favorite Murder? Oh.
Yeah, I've never actually seen it.
I feel like this is
so,
the kind of thing you're not allowed to say out loud. But what's bad about it is that I will stop in 2 seconds. What's bad about it is that it's all researched poorly, so you're not learning anything from it.
And deliberately poorly, too.
Deliberately poorly. And I think that is what bothers me most about it. And I like that I don't care that other people like it. I think that's great. But but it has, for some reason, it's become the standard bearer of women and true crime. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because it has a huge audience of women, and but it is the bottom of the barrel of true crime entertainment. I said Adnan did it, and then I said that, and now I just have to go into hiding.
And yet, did all of you see the news story from this morning where this woman
Yes.
who had been attacked, she was in the process of being attacked, and she fended off her attacker? Why? Because she was an avid listener of My Favorite Murder and figured out techniques from the podcast as to how to fend off her attacker. So
It stayed sexy.
maybe not. But I also have a huge problem with that podcast and others along those same lines, because as a journalist, it just gets my hackles up. It's like, these are real people who were the victims of horrible crimes. They often have family members who are still alive and might be privy to not just listening or watching it, but also people coming back at them and being like, I saw this show, or I listened to this podcast, and what's up? And so it's dehumanizing what happened, as opposed and so even though as a writer I want to make sure that people read my work so that by definition that's entertaining, at the same time I'm always aware that there are real people, and I have to sort of put myself on the line morally and ethically. Anyway, that's my spiel.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, it's one I have a lot of mixed feelings about. I used to listen to it all the time, but I still sort of hated it. Because I feel I think the thing is that I have I don't actually care that much that it's glib. I think that they are kind of trying to do something where it's we're kind of trying to make it funny, and they know that what they're doing is, not going to sit well with everybody. And I think that they are kind of trying to point out some of the absurdity and humor that is within these stories. But at the same time, I actually think that they really replicate a lot of sort of troubling narratives about crime. And they bring up, and they are very, very interested in victims' rights, but not in a very smart way. And a lot of it is sort of oh, we should put everyone in jail forever. No, they really say stuff like that. Why do we ever let people out of jail? Or they talk about oh, I'm actually in favor of the death penalty because of this. I feel even though progressive women, listen to it, it doesn't mean the show is very progressive. I feel like the show is actually quite regressive in a lot of their attitudes about crime, because they're learning about crime from watching Dateline exclusively. That's the problem. You're just watching Forensic Files. Forensic Files has an agenda, which is to tell you that forensic science is great and that all crimes are solved very easily by forensic science. That is not true. And so if that's the only way that you learn about crime, you are not very educated about crime.
Yeah, the crime as entertainment thing is very controversial. That podcast is one thing, but it extends far beyond it to these even very premiere shows. I remember, I think that there's no show that people are watching at the same time that's more fun to talk about than these crime stories, right? It's the day Robert Durst goes into the bathroom after having a sandwich and says he killed everyone. That was I heard that around Brooklyn, And I think there's a sense where, of course, we're going to be entertained by these things, but I think that's a strange term to use. It's there's something about looking into the darkest part of what we're capable of that is both like, I mean, that essay about why women, there's been a few that have come out. Chelsea Summers wrote one, Megan Abbott wrote one about why women are interested in true crime. And it's kind of like staring down the darkness and understanding that these are where we can talk about taboos. These are the places that we can explore what might happen to us or what has happened to us. At the same time, I think the idea of making it into entertainment is extremely risky. It's a thin line.
Yeah.
I think there's a line between like entertaining and titillating too, which so if you're exploring the kind of like that, there's also like the idea of like what is true crime, right? So that like to me the Me Too story is a true crime story. To me that Ezra Klein documentary about O.J. Simpson is a true crime documentary, but they don't necessarily get treated in that way.
Well, there's also just the fact that the only real narratives that people enjoy in the U.S. are, crime stories. It's like, what kind of book can you buy at the grocery store? I mean, these, like, it's very odd how central murder stories and mysteries are to our culture. It wasn't always like that, and it has a lot to do with sort of our obsession with journalism and daily journalism, and also with the incredible violence of our culture, and the fact that the mystery story that's the only story kind of left that kind of challenges us. And so the true crime is sort of the apex of that. I mean, I think that, that's the kind of entertainment that we like. We like entertainment that's brutal and upsetting. That's the only kind of entertainment there is in the US, and like Kardashians,
Wait till the Kardashians do true crime, right?
Yeah.
They're doing it. Chloe is doing Sisters Who Kill.
Oh, I did
with
see this,
Investigation
yes.
Discovery, and I can't
Sister
wait.
to kill? Which sister is she killing?
I don't know.
She has so many.
We have time for one more question in the...
Sorry.
You.
Yeah.
Hi, could you talk a little bit more about the role of beauty in the dead girl trope? Like, is it so that the male investigator can feel like a beautiful woman is indebted to him? Is it just that we need that victim to be beautiful so that we can truly see the death as tragic? What various roles does that play in the trope?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it, I think the reason that dead girls are beautiful is because there's this weird sexual obsession with her body on the part of the detective, and it can be ambiguous, but it's clearly a sexual symbol of a certain kind of like youth and fecundity. So it's actually I'm just thinking about this. Why don't you guys talk?
Well, I think about it in terms of Laura, mostly the film, because that's what people know, but also the original novel by Vera Caspary, which kind of really unpacks this whole idea of like, she's beautiful, she's dead, you only get her perspective through men, and yet slowly the narrative unspools in a way that is really surprising and disturbing, because you see just that this woman actually had a career, she had agency, all the men in her life completely underestimate her. And you kind of get a sense in that in the film, but Otto Preminger, the director, didn't really understand it, and he would fight with Vera Caspary, the author, about it constantly, and his vision more or less won out. So you get like the big portrait of Jean Cherney as Laura, and I feel like she is absolutely the apex and embodiment of this beauty dead girl trope.
Yeah, I think it kind of also goes back to reinforcing the sort of Madonna horror binary that women are forced into, which is that if you die young and beautiful, you're forever virginal in the eyes of the detective, and also the people that survived you, and you get to be sort of frozen in time as this beauty, and then if you continue on, you become femme fatale, and possibly you did it. It's like and I think there's this sense that like you remain innocent if you're dead, which is just a horrible thing, but it is what's put on women, which is like if you were to die young and beautiful, pristine forever, like that maybe, and that there's something about that I find disturbing.
I have this really weird thought that is not intellectual at all, but when I got into my late 30s, I suddenly realized that if I died, it would not be like a real tragedy. They'd be like, it wouldn't be like this young woman in the, it'd be like, oh, this lady who was like, had a life. And like feeling really weird about that, especially because, that's it.
But I also think youth and beauty are kind of enforced for victims, though. Quite often, a woman who maybe in her daily life people wouldn't have called her, a beautiful girl.
Right.
Then when she's killed, that is the way that she's described, because it's a way of simplifying women. It's a way of showing what we value them for. And it's kind of the only way that women are sympathetic to us, is if it's like, she was so pretty. It shows what we value. The fact that the dead girl is always beautiful. It's like, what do you have to offer? Your beautiful body.
Well, and it sort of like ratifies why they're trying to solve the murder. It's like, it's more, again, it comes back to privilege, but it's like, which bodies are considered worth finding justice for? And it's the most beautiful of the bunch, socially. It's there's something about that that's deeply wrong.
And the fact that beauty is always young, virginal, white, and it sort of comes back to, again, unpacking whiteness in this context.
Yeah, for sure.
Do we have time for one more? Or? Okay. There was that. Okay.
Thanks. I suppose this question is for Alice, but I was wondering if you could make sort of a further moral statement about dead girl shows. In other words, are we wrong as a society to enjoy them so much, to create them so much? And if so, what would a healthier society, what alternative would a healthier society produce?
Well, I think that, in the end, where I come down on it is that I think that if our society were more just and more fair and more ethical and more compassionate, we would not be as interested in shows about people being horribly murdered, especially women. And so ultimately, I think that, well, it's like in Clueless where Cher is like, until you can't see violence on the news, why take it out of films that you need it for entertainment value? That's kind of actually my argument. But I think the fact is that we need to start elsewhere, probably, than, TV to talk about our problem with misogyny and violence against women. We need to start, in our everyday lives. But at the same time, I think that we can be more critically engaged with what we consume, the media we consume, and also we can be more more creative with the kind of, books and shows and movies that we choose to create. And I think there are people who are doing that. There are people who are trying to, subvert these genres and also sort of open up new kinds of narratives and new kinds of roles for women and new kinds of representation. So yeah, I feel like it's not something to lose sleep over necessarily if you enjoy, watching Twin Peaks, but it is something that we don't just have to be kind of blind consumers. It doesn't have to be narcotic for us. We can be engaged consumers.
That's a really good answer.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it's just about also just holding the entertainment that you like accountable. Even if you binge a series over the weekend, I think it's worth reflecting on what it did and didn't do. It's fine if you were entertained, but also, did they have enough story? Did they tell you who the victim was? Did they humanize that person or brush by it because it was narratively inconvenient? And I think that we have to be constantly probing this entertainment, which again, like Alice said, I don't think you can solve the world's problems by not watching a particular television program, but I think it's worth investigating, what you get out of it, and if it didn't give you what you were looking for, go deeper, learn the stories.
Yeah, it's part of the problem with fan culture that all of our discourse is I loved it, I hated it. And we're kind of oddly loyal to the things that we're fans of, and it's like that thing is not loyal to you. Probably. So, kind of not thinking of yourself as a fan, but thinking of yourself as sort of a viewer or a consumer, and taking a nuanced view of what you choose to watch. There are things I like to watch that I also like to critique and make fun of a lot. And that's
Those are
how I
sometimes
became
the most interesting
critic.
things to watch, because you're doing both of those things at once.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because then you're just engaged on several different levels. It's not just, I liked it, but there's no substance to it. There's actually an argument. There's actually engagement. So I think with that, thank you all so much
Thank
for
you so
coming.
much.
Thank you to Rachel and to Leah for being part of this.